I'm Ann Jurecic. I'm an associate professor in the English department, and I just finished a book called Illness as Narrative. The book is about this phenomenon that anyone who's walked into a Barnes & Noble's and looked in the health section may have noticed, which is that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books that come out pretty much every year that are personal narratives about illness or disability or dysfunction of some kind, physical dysfunction of some kind. And they're incredibly popular. People buy them, they read them, people write them. And what's surprising for someone who studies literature in the 20th century is that these books didn't always exist. It wasn't the case in the mid-20th century that a lot of people were writing memoirs of illness. So one of the questions that struck me is that where did they come from? Why are we so interested in reading them now? Why are so many people interested in writing them now? And that was really sort of what got me started thinking about the topic for this book. And then once I got started, I realized that there wasn't a single easy answer to that question, that there were many answers to that question, and this concatenation of events, cultural events and social events that came together to sort of create the conditions for this coming into being. The main sort of juxtaposition that I had was between the 1918 flu, where all over the world, more than 50 million people died of the 1918 flu, yet that is virtually absent in English and American literature. And then you move forward 65, 70 years to the HIV/AIDS crisis in the US, and literally tens of thousands of texts emerge from people's experiences at that moment in time. So what happened in that space during the 20th century that all of a sudden made it possible for this new kind of literature to sort of to take hold and grab hold of people's imaginations? So one of the many things that happened was a real change in medical institutions and the medical profession itself. So the 1918 flu, I think people know more about it now than they maybe did 15 years ago, but it was a pandemic. It was a global flu. And it hit in one of the late years of World War I and spread globally. There were fewer records kept. One of the things we do know is that more soldiers, American soldiers, in the war died of the flu than died of battle injuries. And we really don't have a good record worldwide about how many people died. I said more than 50 million, but some estimates go up to 100 million people worldwide. I mean, it's an inconceivable number of people that we're talking about. And then you think, well, surely there are novels about that and stories about that. And as far as I could find, there was one novel written by Catherine Ann Porter called Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and that takes the flu as its centerpiece. And elsewhere, it's in the background, but it's really not much there. So we don't know very much at all about what the experience of people was in and around that pandemic, because all we have are numbers. We don't have the stories. One of the biggest changes came in the 70s with the women's health movement. Women were suddenly, through feminism and first wave of feminism or second wave, discovering that their reproductive health was their own, and their bodies were something that they should understand and have choices about. Out of that movement came an enormous number of new feminist stories about reproductive health, about breast cancer, about childbearing. And so it was a real sort of it was part of the radical change of that wave of feminism. And that, I think, is part of what led to the openness to these stories that came then a decade later with the AIDS and HIV crisis. So those are three sort of touchstone moments for the development of these narratives in the United States. People were writing private letters sometimes, but there weren't, again, as I said, people weren't writing memoirs about the experience. And I think a part of that was that acute illnesses like cholera and like the flu and like typhoid and and other things and tuberculosis, they were much more mundane experiences. We're talking about an era when none of these diseases was treatable. There were no vaccines. People didn't know ahead of time that it was coming. Now we get warnings about which flu strains are in the air this year, and we're talking about a time when people didn't know that at all. And before 1870s, didn't even have the concept of bacteria, right? So the kinds of ways that people thought about them were mythologized, right? They didn't have any kind of basis in science, but there was also, I think, much less acceptance of personal narratives about these things because they weren't things you talked about. And I think that may have been in part because they were frightening. We went from the era of family practice and doctors who would visit people's homes and visit them there and see them there, and who knew generations of a family because the doctor was in town and knew the grandparents and the parents and the children of the children, to moments where we go into our doctor and if we're lucky we have 11 minutes to talk to the doctor in our HMO or whatever. And one of the things that happened in that period is that people's stories, their life stories, as well as their body stories, there's no time for them anymore. So they got sort of shunted off to the side. And it just seems as if those stories have to be told. One way or another, they have to come out. And one of the ways in which they came out in an era when storytelling, or even writing stories and printing stories, was relatively cheap, is that they started to appear in publications, in magazines and in books, and now online, everywhere online. In the book itself, I focused on memoir more than anything else, but not to the exclusion of other forms. So there's places where I look at an occasional novel or even a poet here or there, but mostly I was really interested in the shaping and how people tell their own stories of embodied life. One of the things that I find about academic books that I love is that they tend, and this fits with the fact that I'm writing about narrative, is that they tend to have a narrative arc, that there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. And I wanted to figure out a way in which I could write a scholarly book that would touch on a lot of different topics, but that would in fact evolve and develop. And so I started with the historical story of where did these narratives come from, how did they develop, and why do they matter? So that seemed the place to open up the big questions was at that point. I knew that I wanted to deal with Susan Sontag, who's probably, as a writer, is more responsible than anyone else for drawing people's attention to the relationship between literature and pain. I borrowed from her title in the title of my book. She has a 1978 book called Illness as Metaphor. And that book sort of really writes about how literature has created dangerous mythologies about illnesses like tuberculosis and cancer. And I'm taking a slightly less critical view of what literature can do in my own book. But I wanted to write about her and the arc of her career and the real transformations in her thinking about how to represent the suffering of other people. She started at the very beginning of her career believing that, believing that empathy and sympathy was really impossible to communicate in a photograph. That was her real concern, photographs of suffering, photographs of war. By the end of her career, though, she was writing novels, and she said the reason she wanted to write novels was to make people cry. And it was because she also said, photographs haunt us, narratives can make us understand. In her early work, she was an essayist. In Illness as Metaphor, she was making an argument. What she refused to do in Illness as Metaphor is she refused to tell her own story. It turns out when she was writing that book, she was in fact being treated for breast cancer. But she didn't tell that story. It was an anti-narrative in many ways, that book. But by the end of her life, she'd gotten around to this point where she really wanted to sort of work with how do we tell stories about these things that will in fact bridge distances and differences. So she was the center of my book. And then I wanted to end in the classroom with questions about how do we teach people to read in ways that will make them receptive to this book? So, and in between, I had chapters about risk and pain and theories of literary criticism. One of the chapters in the book is about pain. And there's a theory in cultural studies that has been around since 1985. A scholar named Elaine Scarry wrote a book, a wonderful book, a famous, rightly famous book called The Body in Pain. And the theory that she has is that pain is unspeakable, that especially the pain of torture, and that was her primary focus at first. The pain of torture destroys language. It takes you to this place that's anterior to language. And so pain becomes a place or an experience, to come back to empathy, for which one can never have total understanding or total empathy, because the interior life and suffering of someone is inaccessible, her theory goes, unless you have language. So for many, many years, this idea that pain destroys language had currency in the literary critical world. But when you sit back and you look at the narratives that people are writing explicitly about the bodily experience of pain, one of the things that you see immediately is that they're not outside language, right? Some things may be. Torture, for instance, may be. Scarry's theory was that language can't name pain. And I get that, right? That idea that something could precisely identify it so that everybody could always understand exactly what someone meant when they used this word with regard to pain. But narrative is something different from naming. And I think that you can see all over the place these these stories of pain that are invitations to understanding. They're not claiming to name pain. They're just opening a door to understanding and sort of creating this, creating a character and a story arc that helps people to begin to understand them. So it was a real eye-opener for me, who as a graduate student was trained to read, Scarry's text and to believe, she's a brilliant woman, that this was the case. And then to realize that pain often opens up a narrative perspective, a literary perspective, instead of shutting it down. And that's really important for people in my field to understand. And for doctors, it's also really important to understand that the naming isn't going to happen. The story can happen. And that opens up the chance for asking questions and inviting more engagement. If, for instance, one of the techniques that physicians and nurses will use in a hospital setting, for instance, to ask about someone's pain is to say, they'll come in and they'll say, where's your pain on the scale from 1 to 10, if 1 is no pain, or 0 is no pain, and 10 is the worst pain you've ever felt. And a person can give them a number, and that's an automatic gauge for, they have a sense of, they want to hear something below 5. That numerical way of gauging pain is easy and quick, but it doesn't give you a sense of the full human being in that bed, or what that pain means to them, and all the sort of complications that can open up out of the fact that pain may mean something, may have a meaning that's so much more powerful even than the physical sensation itself. So in that way, perhaps that's what we're getting at, this idea that there's a limit to the understanding that can come through the quick and easy, I have to be in and out of this room in 30 seconds kind of way of gauging whether and how somebody is in pain. And the main reason to write the book was to get people to pay attention to this form and to think about its cultural importance. And if that's what happens, I think that has the potential to enrich both literary studies, which hadn't been paying much attention to narratives of illness, and also to medical humanities and medical education, where attunement to the ways in which people tell their stories and the language that they use to tell them, I think, is also really important. So those would be two fantastic outcomes. Thinking about who would read the book, I'm people who are interested, anyone who's interested in literature, and especially interested in literature that's being written now, in the late 20th century, early 21st century. I'm excited that the book sort of exists at this intersection between literary studies and maybe the medical humanities. So a lot of the feedback that I've gotten and a lot of the reviews that I've gotten so far have been in medical humanities journals. So I know that there are physicians and medical educators who are also reading this book. And it's nice to be able to get feedback from a range of people. When I wrote this book, I was reading far outside of my discipline. So it's nice to sort of get a sense that the book too might be reaching beyond the discipline. The last chapter of Illness as Narrative, I'm writing about pedagogy, and I know I opened up questions in that chapter that I didn't quite answer to my own satisfaction. So now I'm working with a colleague, Richard Miller, on a book called Habits of the Creative Mind, which will be a book for writers and writing teachers about how to access one's own curiosity and creativity as habits of mind that need to be practiced in order for students to really take hold of their own educations. So I'm in the thick of that right now and really excited about it.